The quiet of the morning was suddenly shattered by a frantic call to 911. On the other end of the line was a man's voice, shaking with panic. It was Joe. His words came out jumbled, but the desperation in his tone was unmistakable. He already knew. Something terrible had happened. Emergency responders arrived quickly, but there was nothing they could do except confirm Joe's worst fear. Kathy was dead. And worst of all, the circumstances surrounding her death made one thing painfully clear. This was no accident. It wasn't natural causes. At first glance, everything in the bedroom seemed tidy, but one detail stood out. A large jewelry box was left open, its drawers pulled out, and several pieces were missing. Kathy Blair was born on May 31, 1961, in California. From an early age, she showed a remarkable talent for music, singing along to church hymns and school songs with a voice that stood out. After finishing high school, Kathy's love for music guided her next steps. She enrolled at the University of Texas, where she chose to study vocal performance. This decision meant a move to Austin, a city known for its thriving music scene, which gave Kathy both inspiration and opportunity. When she graduated, Kathy didn't just pursue a career. She followed a calling. Kathy's personal life brought both joy and hardship. Over the years, she was married twice, and while both marriages ended in divorce, she remained hopeful about love and focused her energy on her children. She became a devoted mother to a son and a daughter, raising them largely on her own. Her children often described her as their anchor, someone who balanced discipline with unconditional love. Even during difficult times, Kathy found strength in her music, her faith, and her role as a mother. By 2013, Kathy was 52 years old and ready for a new chapter. She moved into a cozy home in a quiet suburb of Austin. The neighborhood was considered safe, filled with tree-lined streets and friendly neighbors. By this time, her children were grown and living their own lives, but Kathy's days were still full. In December 2014, her son Joe, who was 23 at the time, came home to stay with her for a few weeks. Joe was serving in the military and was preparing for his next deployment, but before leaving again, he wanted to spend time with his mother. For Kathy, his visit was a blessing. The two shared meals, long conversations, and the kind of small, everyday moments that grow more meaningful with time. On the night of December 5th, Joe went out to meet with friends. He stayed out longer than expected and didn't return until almost noon the following day. Tired but in good spirits, he entered the house and called out for his mom. When she didn't answer, he assumed she might be resting or busy. But as the silence lingered, unease began to creep in. He walked through the home, checking each room until he reached Kathy's bedroom. What he found there left him stunned. Kathy was lying motionless on the floor beside her bed. Joe realized immediately that something was terribly wrong. Overcome with panic, he ran outside and called the authorities. When investigators arrived, they quickly determined that Kathy had passed away several hours earlier. It was evident that this was not a natural death. The scene suggested that someone had entered the home with harmful intent. Specialists carefully examined the area, while officers worked to secure the property and gather initial evidence. One of the earliest observations was the state of Kathy's jewelry box. Its drawers had been pulled out and left scattered across the bedroom floor, suggesting that someone had gone through them hurriedly. Detectives began to consider robbery as a possible motive, though from the beginning there were inconsistencies. While some jewelry appeared to be missing, other valuable possessions, including Kathy's laptop and phone, were untouched, left in plain sight. The house had not been torn apart, and there were no signs that the intruder had searched beyond that single area. Even stranger was the order of events. It appeared that Kathy had been attacked first, and only afterward did the person begin to search for valuables. Forensic specialists noted traces of DNA on the jewelry box and nearby surfaces that pointed to this sequence. This raised an important question. Was robbery truly the motive, or was it staged to mislead investigators? The timing also stood out. Burglaries typically occur during the day, when homeowners are away at work. Breaking into a home at night, especially in such a quiet and safe neighborhood, was unusual and risky. Speaking of doors, investigators noted there were no signs of forced entry at the front of the house. However, the back door was found unlocked. When officers asked Joe about this detail, he explained that his mother often left that particular door open, believing the neighborhood to be safe. Unfortunately, that trust may have provided the intruder with an opportunity. The early investigation left detectives with more questions than answers. Who would want to harm Kathy, a woman so beloved by her students, friends, and family? Was the robbery theory genuine, or was there another reason behind the crime? Despite their determined efforts, forensic specialists struggled to find any evidence that could directly point them toward Kathy's killer. The crime scene had been carefully examined from top to bottom, yet almost nothing useful turned up. The only tangible clue investigators managed to recover was a faint shoe print discovered on the floor of Kathy's bedroom. It had been left behind in a small pool of blood near her body. Unfortunately, the print was only partial, making it difficult to match with certainty to a specific shoe brand or size. Still, detectives held onto it as a possible lead. Meanwhile, medical examiners worked to establish the official cause of death. Their findings confirmed that Kathy had endured a violent attack involving multiple sharp force injuries, and they also noted signs of strangulation. This combination painted a disturbing picture of what had happened inside her home. Forensic science could reveal how Kathy's life was taken, but not who was responsible. With no strong physical evidence to pursue, detectives had to return to the basics of police work, examining Kathy's personal life and the people closest to her. In cases like this, investigators often begin by looking at family members, not out of immediate suspicion, but simply because those who live with or are closest to the victim usually have both access and opportunity. Naturally, their first step was to scrutinize Kathy's son, Joe. He had discovered her body, and theoretically, he would have had the chance to commit the crime. But detectives quickly realized this lead didn't hold weight. Joe had spent the entire night with a group of friends, and several independent witnesses confirmed his whereabouts. Phone records and timelines also supported his story. Within a short period, investigators ruled him out as a suspect. With Joe cleared, detectives widened their search. They spoke with Kathy's circle of friends, fellow choir members, and co-workers from her years as a teacher. Just when it seemed like the investigation was reaching a dead end, a new detail surfaced. Several of Kathy's close friends brought up her second ex-husband, a man she had divorced about 4 years before her death. According to them, Kathy had often spoken about her concerns regarding him. Even after the divorce, he continued to contact her, and at times, his behavior left her unsettled. In fact, she had confided to friends that she was worried for her safety. At one point, she even asked them not to reveal her new address if he ever came looking for her. Intrigued by this information, detectives decided to track the man down. They discovered he was living not far from Austin and arranged to meet with him. From the very beginning, his response raised suspicions. When investigators delivered the news that Kathy had died, his immediate reaction was strange. He blurted out, "Was she shot?" That assumption caught detectives off guard. They had not shared any details about the manner of her death, so why would his mind go straight to the idea of a shooting? Trying to dig deeper, detectives asked about his whereabouts on the night of Kathy's murder. The man explained that he had been staying in his RV, taking what he described as a short getaway. He even offered to let officers search the vehicle without a warrant, seemingly eager to appear cooperative. But despite his odd reaction and the suspicions it raised, the search turned up nothing of value. There were no traces of evidence tying him to Kathy or her home. Without concrete proof, detectives couldn't charge him. He remained on their radar, but investigators knew they had to keep exploring other avenues. A few days later, just as the case seemed to be losing momentum, detectives received an unusual phone call from one of Kathy's close friends. She explained that she had something strange to report from the memorial service that had recently been held in Kathy's honor. During the gathering, as friends and family shared stories and remembered Kathy's life, an unfamiliar man suddenly stood up to speak. From the moment he began, many attendees felt something wasn't right. His tribute sounded fabricated, almost as if he had never truly met Kathy. The room had been filled with Kathy's closest circle, yet not a single person had ever seen this man before. As he continued speaking, his comments became increasingly disconnected from reality, and the audience exchanged confused glances. His story didn't match Kathy's life at all. Detectives grew curious about this mystery speaker. After asking around, one of Kathy's friends realized he had seen the man before. He worked as a sales clerk at a local women's clothing store. Investigators quickly tracked him down and questioned him about his appearance at the memorial. The man admitted openly that he had never known Kathy. Instead, he claimed he had read about her death in the news, felt moved by the story, and decided to attend the memorial service. He said he spoke because he wanted to honor her memory. To detectives, this explanation sounded bizarre. His behavior was unusual and deeply unsettling to those who had been at the service. But in the end, there was nothing illegal about what he had done. With no evidence connecting him to the crime, police had no choice but to let him go. Once again, investigators found themselves without answers. For several days after Kathy's passing, the case sat at a frustrating standstill. Detectives continued working tirelessly, following up on every small lead, but nothing seemed to push the investigation forward. Then, out of nowhere, a twist arrived that breathed new life into the stalled inquiry. A local resident named Rob contacted the police, saying he had something unusual they might want to see. Rob explained that just days earlier, he had purchased a new piece of equipment for his hunting rifle, a high-tech scope equipped with a thermal imaging camera. It wasn't something he had used much before, and he was eager to test it out. In the early hours of December 6th, before dawn, he decided to take a quiet walk toward a wooded area on the edge of his neighborhood to try it out. As Rob strolled along the road with his scope recording, he noticed a vehicle driving slowly past him. The car eventually pulled to the side of the road, stopping in an odd manner as if the driver were waiting or watching. Moments later, a man stepped out of the car and began walking briskly down one of the nearby residential streets, eventually disappearing into the darkness. At the time, Rob thought little of it. But later, when the news of Kathy Blair's tragic death spread across the community, Rob's memory of that night took on a new weight. The direction the man had been walking was toward Kathy's neighborhood. That realization pushed Rob to review the footage his thermal scope had recorded. To his shock, there it was. The man's silhouette, clearly visible in the infrared glow, walking away from his car under the cover of night. When detectives received this footage, they were both intrigued and cautious. On the one hand, it placed a mysterious figure in the area on the very night Kathy was killed. On the other hand, there was a significant problem. Because the camera was thermal, it didn't capture facial features or clear details, only the outline of a person. Identifying someone from a silhouette alone would be nearly impossible. Still, the video did provide useful clues. Investigators noted that the individual appeared tall and broad-shouldered, and his stride had a distinct rhythm that could potentially be recognized by someone who knew him well. Even more valuable was the image of the car. Though it was partially obscured by darkness, the shape and size of the vehicle were visible enough that detectives believed they might be able to narrow down the make and model. They quickly compared the man's build and the vehicle to the two main figures already on their radar: Kathy's second ex-husband and the unsettling stranger who had spoken at her memorial service. But after careful review, neither of them matched the silhouette, and neither owned a car resembling the one in the footage. Then, on December 15th, the fragile calm shattered. That morning, police received a call from a caretaker who was responsible for checking in on an elderly couple, Billy and Sydney Shelton. When she arrived at their home, she immediately sensed that something was wrong. The front door was standing wide open, something highly unusual for the Sheltons. As she drew closer, she saw clear evidence of forced entry around the lock. Hesitant but worried, she stepped inside. The quiet of the house was unsettling, and as she walked further in, she eventually reached the bedroom. What she found there was devastating. The couple lay motionless. Shaken to her core, she hurried outside and dialed the police. Investigators arrived quickly, and what they discovered was chillingly familiar. Medical examiners would later confirm that Billy and Sydney had lost their lives in the same manner as Kathy Blair. Both had suffered multiple stab wounds. Even more disturbing were the parallels in the crime scenes. Just as in Kathy's bedroom, the Sheltons' jewelry box had been pulled open, its drawers scattered across the floor. All of their jewelry had been taken, but once again, nothing else of significant value was missing. Detectives immediately recognized the pattern. The victims lived only about 15 minutes away from Kathy's home. Both attacks had occurred at night, while the victims were inside sleeping. And in both cases, the intruders seemed fixated on the jewelry box, ignoring everything else. The similarities were too strong to be coincidence. From that moment on, investigators began to consider the terrifying possibility that the same person was responsible for both crimes. This revelation shifted the entire direction of the case. At first, detectives had strongly suspected that Kathy's murder was personal, carried out by someone she knew, possibly motivated by resentment or revenge. But now, the discovery of another nearly identical crime forced them to reconsider everything. Investigators urgently began searching for any link between Kathy Blair and the Sheltons. The urgency of the investigation escalated. Detectives began re-interviewing everyone connected to the victims, pleading with them to recall even the smallest, seemingly insignificant detail. Police made it clear, no piece of information was too small to share. It was during this renewed round of questioning that one of Kathy's friends recalled something unsettling she had nearly forgotten. Months before her death, Kathy had told her about an encounter with a handyman who had been hired by her landlord to do some repairs on her home. Kathy hadn't liked the experience at all. Not only had the work been done poorly, but something about the man's behavior had deeply unsettled her. At the time, she had brushed it off, but now, in light of everything that had happened, the memory took on new significance. This recollection gave detectives a new lead, and possibly a new suspect. Sean eventually admitted to detectives that he had first crossed paths with Timothy a few months earlier. From the very beginning, he said, Timothy gave off the impression of being a shady, untrustworthy character, someone he wouldn't normally associate with. According to Sean, their interactions after that initial meeting had been minimal, almost non-existent. But during questioning, he suddenly dropped a statement that caught the detectives' full attention. He revealed that he had actually been in Austin on the exact nights when both murders took place. Even more concerning, he claimed that during those visits he had stayed at Timothy's residence. This revelation turned the entire conversation in a new and confusing direction. At first, Sean insisted that on the night Kathy was killed, Timothy had simply left the house without saying a word. It sounded suspicious, but still placed the blame entirely on Timothy. Yet, only moments later, Sean abruptly shifted his story. He now admitted that the two of them had gone to Kathy's house together that night. According to his new account, Timothy stepped out of the vehicle and returned just a few minutes later, holding a bag that appeared to be stained. As the interview progressed, detectives gave Sean a short break when he asked to use the restroom. One of the investigators casually observed him walking away, and that's when something clicked in the officer's mind. The way Sean moved, his stride, his posture, even the swing of his arms, closely matched the grainy thermal camera footage taken on the night Kathy was killed. That disturbing realization raised a serious question. Had Sean been lying all along? Detectives began to suspect that he was not merely a witness or reluctant accomplice, but possibly the main perpetrator. When he returned from the restroom, they decided to push harder. They told him outright that they didn't believe his version of events, and floated the idea that perhaps Timothy had pressured him into entering Kathy's home. Maybe, they suggested, Sean had been threatened or manipulated into participating. This strategic move had the desired effect. Sean hesitated, struggled with his words, and then shifted his story once more. This time he admitted that he had indeed entered the house, but claimed that his intention was only to steal valuables. According to Sean, Timothy remained outside while he slipped through an unlocked back door. He described how he crept through the rooms in search of anything worth taking. Eventually, he reached Kathy's bedroom, where he spotted a jewelry box. He said Kathy was still asleep at the time, and he quietly began collecting valuables. At first, Sean stuck firmly to this narrative, insisting that he had never harmed Kathy, and that after gathering valuables, he slipped back outside and rejoined Timothy. He even suggested that Timothy may have re-entered the house afterward and committed the murder himself, for reasons Sean claimed not to know. But detectives were unconvinced. They knew from forensic evidence that DNA had been found on the jewelry box, proving that the valuables were taken only after the murder, not before. Sean's story simply didn't fit. Investigators challenged him relentlessly, pointing out every contradiction. Eventually, the pressure worked. Sean's defenses crumbled, and he confessed to being responsible for Kathy's death. His explanation was that when he entered the bedroom, Kathy unexpectedly woke up. Startled and afraid of being caught, he claimed he panicked. He said she moved toward him, and in a moment of fear, he pulled out a knife and attacked. Afterward, he admitted, he quickly grabbed the jewelry, rushed out, and got back into the car where Timothy was waiting. Even with this confession, detectives remained skeptical about parts of his story. They doubted that Kathy had suddenly lunged at him, or that the attack had unfolded exactly the way he described. But regardless of these doubts, the admission itself was enough for an arrest. To solidify their case, investigators collected Sean's shoes and compared the tread pattern to a bloody footprint left at the crime scene. The results were undeniable. It was a perfect match. However, one large problem remained unresolved: the separate case of the murdered elderly couple. When detectives questioned Sean about that crime, his demeanor shifted immediately. He asked for a lawyer and refused to answer any more questions. Without direct evidence connecting him to that case, investigators were left at a dead end, so they turned their focus back to Timothy. He was arrested as an accomplice in Kathy's murder, and under Texas law, that meant he faced the same charges as Sean, even if he hadn't personally committed the act. During questioning, Timothy admitted that he had indeed driven Sean to Kathy's house, but he insisted that he had never set foot inside, claiming he had no knowledge that Sean planned to harm anyone. However, Timothy did confess to helping sell Kathy's stolen jewelry afterward. That alone tied him directly to the crime. When pressed about the case of the elderly couple, Timothy provided yet another damaging admission. He and Sean had gone to that house intending to commit a burglary as well. But just as before, he claimed that he stayed in the car while Sean went inside. The law recognized that even if he had not directly inflicted the fatal injuries, his actions and choices had placed him squarely within the circle of responsibility. Sean, on the other hand, faced an immediate and more specific charge. He was officially indicted for Kathy's murder. Yet when it came to the second case, detectives still lacked the level of evidence necessary to bring formal charges, at least at that stage. The court eventually ruled that the two men would be tried separately. During Timothy's trial, the defense attempted to present him as someone caught up in events beyond his control. Timothy himself maintained that he had no knowledge of Sean's intentions, claiming that he had never agreed to or anticipated any act of violence. According to his version of events, he was simply giving Sean rides, never realizing that a serious crime was about to unfold. But testimony and evidence painted a very different picture. Detectives and prosecutors highlighted the fact that Timothy had not only driven Sean to both crime scenes, but had also taken part in the aftermath by profiting from the sale of Kathy's stolen jewelry. To the jury, this painted him not as an unwitting bystander, but as an active participant who knew enough to benefit from the crimes. After careful deliberation, the jury reached a verdict of guilty, and Timothy was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Sean's trial proved to be a much more complex and contested battle. Unlike Timothy, who was tied to Kathy's case through tangible items such as stolen property, Sean's case rested on a combination of his own statements and limited forensic links. The most incriminating pieces of evidence included his earlier confession, the partial shoe print discovered in Kathy's bedroom. From the very beginning, Sean's defense attorney went on the offensive, arguing that detectives had used aggressive tactics to extract a confession and that his client had been pressured into accepting blame for something he had not done. The lawyer also asserted that the other pieces of evidence, while suspicious, were circumstantial and insufficient to prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. Despite these challenges, prosecutors refused to back down. They reinforced their case by emphasizing how the confession aligned with known details. After months of legal maneuvering, Sean found himself back in court for a second trial. This time, prosecutors presented their case with greater precision and clarity, managing to convince the jury of his guilt. Even with the convictions, lingering questions haunted the case. One of the biggest mysteries was the motive behind Sean's actions. Detectives struggled to understand why he had chosen to end Kathy's life. If she had woken unexpectedly while he was in the bedroom, he had the option to simply flee. The room was dark, visibility was poor, and she would not have been able to clearly identify him. The question of the elderly couple's deaths was even more perplexing. Detectives explored whether Timothy's history with them might have overlapped through church or local connections, perhaps giving rise to another personal conflict. Yet this line of thought was never supported by concrete evidence and remained pure speculation. When it came to Sean, another troubling possibility emerged, one that investigators could not completely ignore. Perhaps there had been no rational motive at all. Perhaps his actions were not born from anger, revenge, or financial gain, but from something far more unsettling: the urge to harm without reason.